Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where every day we explore how technology is transforming businesses, industries, your life, and even world. And today, I want to explore the world of CustomerCloud shared responsibility, zero trust computing, and emerging threats. And I've invited Joseph Davids onto the podcast, and he's a cybersecurity, data privacy, business risk, and information compliance advisor for the US health and life science fields at Microsoft. And he's part of a global team of former CISOs, cybersecurity leaders, and Azure security subject matter experts under Microsoft Security Solutions area, formerly CSG, who advises Microsoft strategic customers on their security, information compliance, data privacy, risk management strategies, and all that exciting stuff. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to Massachusetts in the US so we can speak with Joseph about all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Neil, and I really appreciate you having me on the show. I'm Joseph Davis. I'm the Chief Security Advisor for Health and Life Science focus area at Microsoft.
And you're someone that strives to accelerate cloud adoption, migration, and modern workplace transformation through innovative cybersecurity products, engagements, and programs. But the question I've got to ask before we dig any deeper on all that is, where did it all begin? I mean, can you remember where your love of technology came from and what it was that put you on the path you're on today?
Yes, absolutely. So my love of tech and solving complex technical puzzles, right? You know, the types of puzzles that were hidden from the average consumer at that time. It dates back to my childhood and teen years in the 70s and the 80s. I took a detour into medical sciences, and then later on, after I realized that really wasn't my path, I went right back into technology. So I started working at IBM in the mid-90s. And across the board, my love of the cloud specifically, not just technology, but cloud and cloud security came from, the struggles that I had as a chief information security officer at two multinational companies in deploying well over 24, if not 36, different types of security products and services in our environment, very, very large environments, respectively. And the cloud brought us a fantastic user experience once we started to adopt it appropriately. A lot of lower maintenance. And just really, those were the things that I experienced when I was first using the cloud in the last CISO role I had back in 2015. We no longer really had to build solutions, deploy applications, deploy appliances. We could just subscribe to a service and activate the service for ourselves or our users. And that's really the brilliance of the cloud, in a nutshell, never mind the fact that it's hyper scalable.
Absolutely. And fast forward to 2021, here we are, and the industry is changing at breakneck speed. It can be hard to keep up with, but equally, the reality is it probably never moved this slow again, which is just mind-blowing on its own. And the CEO of Microsoft said just last year that they'd gone through 2 years of digital transformation inside just 2 months. So if we expand on that and where we are now, can you tell me more about the CustomerCloud shared responsibility model, and how do various cloud models reflect who is responsible for what? Because I think this is an increasingly big topic in business right now, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there are generally three models to talk about, and that most are familiar with anyone who's been involved with the cloud. There's the infrastructure as a service model, the platform as a service model, and the software as a service model, with the last model being the easiest one to onboard and basically just flip a switch or activate a subscription, and you have a fully functioning service that would have normally been an application somewhere on premises or with a partner. And that's really very, very exciting for especially the business. The business isn't interested in becoming technical administrators. The business is interested in getting their work done. And I'm all for that. As a security officer, my feeling is don't get in the way of what they're trying to do, because typically your users are just going to go around it anyway, because it's too frustrating. So this shared responsibility model means that the cloud security provider, or I'm sorry, the cloud services provider takes on a lot of the responsibility for the underlying infrastructure, the patching of software, the maintenance of machines, et cetera, in the software as a service model. As you get to a platform as a service model, you get to eliminate some of that infrastructure, but not all of it. So you would say, in the past, you would install, let's use Microsoft SQL as an example, Microsoft SQL database. You would have to install that on a server or a cluster of servers. Now it's available as a service, where the back end is really obfuscated from the user. They were just getting a SQL connection, right? A connection into a database, and that's platform as a service. So, and in an infrastructure as a service, it's one of those, you can build up an on-prem type of implementation with virtual machines and firewalls, switches and routers and all that. They all happen to be virtual, but it's that older model in the cloud. Now, when you take on that older model, you're going to be responsible for pretty much 95% of it. The only thing you're not going to be responsible for is the hardware as a consumer of these services. With PaaS, you're going to be responsible for the configuration of the service that you're running. So all the security around it, et cetera, that's going to be your responsibility. And of course, in every model, including SaaS, and SaaS is the only model where the responsibilities are going to be limited to user accounts, devices, and data. All the models are basically user accounts, devices, and data, but SaaS, that's all you're responsible for. And I say basically the security of those three things.
And you mentioned security there, and of course, one of the biggest buzzwords in cybersecurity is zero trust now. And there will be many business leaders listening and decision makers that might have been intimidated by the complexity of this new trend. So can I ask that you set the scene and tell me more about exactly what zero trust is and how it functions for people that are hearing about it for the first time or just wanting to dig deeper and fully understand it?
I'm a massive advocate of zero trust. It's something I was trying to achieve as a CISO back in 2011, 2012. And the way I was trying to achieve it was with a technology called network access control. Now, that still plays a big part with respect to on-premises, but it's really only active when you're on-premises, meaning, I'm coming back from a business trip and connecting from my office, onto the corporate network. My machine might get evaluated to see if it's been involved in any kind of malware or command and control, potentially, if it's running the correct versions of software, if it's been patched, updated, et cetera. Well, that was not very portable. It was like, okay, we're gonna make sure that you're clean and compliant before your machine participates in accessing resources on our network. That's essentially network access control. The problem with that model is it's not very portable, like I said earlier. With zero trust, the model becomes completely portable and leans more heavily on user risk and slightly less on device risk. And the reason I say slightly less on device risk is because it depends how much insight your zero trust implementation will have into that particular user's device. If that user is a contractor, if that's not a corporate managed device, you might not get full insight into how healthy that device is. So you're going to assume breach on that device and increase the risk on that device. But the user or the identity, you might be able to get much more visibility into the identity. And those combined factors create a zero trust conditional access environment, meaning we're using the hyperscale of the cloud to evaluate risk of the user, risk of the device before it gets access to resources. And those resources could be in the cloud or on premises. Now, zero trust is not a product. It's not something you just buy. It's basically a homogeny of products, right? Connected together, sharing signal, and relying very, very heavily on the hyperscale of the cloud to do predictive analysis and understand exactly what the threat or the risk might look like on the user side or the device side before granting access. The reason we call it conditional access within the zero trust world is that, maybe you're not going to get if you're in a high risk state for some reason, right? Depending on maybe where you are, what kind of device you're using, and its relationship to the company. At that given time, you might not have access to everything you normally have access to. Maybe you just have access to certain things that are of less importance, right? Less sensitivity, if you will, based on a data classification model. Maybe as you become more compliant, you're coming from a compliant device. Maybe you're not coming from, a relative's computer. If you're away on holiday and you're trying to get into a work resource with a non-trusted computer, you might be, reduced to just being able to access really, really low-level sensitivity documentation. But when you're using your corporate registered computer and your identity is at a low risk, maybe you'll gain full access to everything. And that's really the user experience, and it doesn't limit you to say, all right, now that you're, in the cloud and the only time you're going to be able to get full access to everything is if you're on premises. Now it allows you to do things like work from home during the pandemic, et cetera, or maybe get some work done while you're on a flight, using their Wi-Fi services on the airline, and so on and so forth.
And I think for many years, organizations resisted, and in many cases even feared zero trust because of how much time, money, and hassle that they thought it might bring to the organization. And I'm curious, has that perception changed now with decision makers from the conversations you're having with businesses?
We're finding that more and more customers are interested in zero trust. There are maybe a handful of customers that are on a zero trust deployment journey. And we've been helping our customers and telling them exactly what they need to do first, the low hanging fruit, what's going to give them the most business value, and do it in phases and increments and not try and boil the ocean and do it all at once. Also, one of the things that we're trying to impart to our customers is this concept of change enablement to ensure that users aren't blindsided by these changes in their environment, because users get very, very stuck in their ways and then they're used to doing things a certain way. I mean, everyone does, right? So that's going to change how they work. It's going to open up possibilities for them, meaning, it used to be that, okay, maybe I can only access these medical records while I'm in the hospital as a hospital employee. But now there's the potential to collaborate on medical records while, maybe I'm not on call and I'm a physician and I am from my home and I'm doing a roundtable with other physicians regarding one case. Maybe we can do things like within a specific teleconferencing program like Teams or Zoom or something like that. We can all be looking at the medical records. We could be talking about the patient. And in the past, we weren't able to do that. Now, zero trust enables a lot of that. So that's why it's getting so much. The other reason it's getting so much attention is because users are really demanding it. Is it difficult? Is it expensive? It really depends on how you approach it. If you take an integrated approach, very, very simple to implement. Of course, you still have to do it in increments. You can't do it all at once. And you typically start with identity and devices, and then you start to apply those controls to the resources later on that you have in your environment or in the cloud that are yours. But if you choose to go what's known as a best of breed route, where you're selecting products from different vendors, which may or may not integrate well, you're going to have to plan time and money, basically effort, into integrating those single point solutions to get kind of an integrated experience and to make zero trust happen. So that's really where the frustration typically comes in.
And I'm curious, what is the risk reduction advantage of zero trust, especially versus other approaches to access, would you say?
Well, you know exactly what you're dealing with. The old
Yeah.
model was a firewall model, right? So it's like, okay, everything behind the firewall is safe and secure. This entire enterprise network of 150,000 devices, everything's safe here. And that's a really, really dangerous assumption because as enterprise networks grew, first of all, firewalls are great and necessary, but they're port level, meaning the best analogy I can use on this is that you're blocking some channels on the television, but you're allowing other channels to come into your home. But what about if those other channels that you're allowing to come into your home contain content you don't want your children seeing, right? That's when you have to put parental controls around the actual content. That's essentially what Zero Trust is doing. It's not doing this broad stroke of saying, okay, we're not going to allow the FTP protocol, and we're not going to allow the XYZ protocol to enter our network or to leave our network. What Zero Trust does is it evaluates the risk of the device and what that device is doing, and the user and what that user is doing, what that user has done, what that user's been responsible for. If it looks like that user account has been attempted a compromise, et cetera, on that account by another person or another entity outside of the country in which they normally operate, all that gets factored in. Right. So you could get really fine-grained access control to say, okay, when a user and a device are in this mode, allow them to access these 5 things. But if they're in a higher risk mode, maybe they're coming in from a country we don't trust, or maybe they're having a history of doing things that seem anomalous to us, then only allow them access to these 2 resources. And you typically don't get that with the old model of once you're behind the firewall, you have access to everything.
And if we look at things at an elevated level, what would you say are the most recent threats to all organisations and governments, whether they're private or even the public sector?
Yeah, and I always respond to this question about, and I talk about emerging threats because it's kind of the cool buzzword, but we have to be rational and realize that none of these threats are really new. They're basically back to the future, or all things remain the same kind of thing. What's old is new again. What we're looking at are threats primarily. We saw, in December, the Solarigate issue with the supply chain attack. That's a really sophisticated attack that's very, very hard to detect. And thank goodness now we have the power of cloud and machine learning models to detect anomalies within written code and assembler code, which is very, very tedious and arduous and difficult to review by eyesight and by hand. So we're leveraging artificial intelligence to help review code, even if it's considered trustworthy, because maybe we considered it trustworthy based on the wrong controls. And we have to really trust but verify that the code hasn't been tampered with. But that is nothing new. I mean, we saw that in the early 2000s with hardware supply chain tampering, where we had nation states putting, for lack of a better term, bugs in things like cell towers that they would sell us to commercial entities in the West, et cetera, or server blades. There were little surveillance technologies that were put in there to remain undetected. So now we're seeing this with software. So that's one of the quote unquote emerging threats, but quite frankly, it's not a new threat. It's one of those threats that's very, very difficult to manage. We're seeing an advanced ransomware. Of course, we saw ransomware with the NHS several years ago with some large pharmaceutical companies and shipping companies and so forth. But this ransomware is more insidious in that it's what's called human operated ransomware, which means it's persistent. It's like that extortionist who never goes away. You think you've got it, you've gotten the mechanisms for ransomware out of your network, and it comes right back again because it's, again, very, very difficult to detect. And lastly, patching. And one would say, well, patching, that's like security 101. We were talking about patching in 1998. And it's true. But it remains one of the biggest problems because we've got code out there across all manufacturers, not just Microsoft, but we saw it with Microsoft Exchange on premises 2 months ago, where, we had 4 major bugs in the code that were brought to our attention by Bug Bounty. And we've, once we had a fix for this, we threw up a flag and said, okay, stop the presses. It's very, very dangerous if you continue to operate your Exchange servers without patching them. What I've noticed in my 26 years in IT and cybersecurity is that systems go in, and that maybe the operating systems get patched on Patch Tuesday. But when you're starting to deal with more esoteric components like the applications themselves or the firmware and hardware that's running these virtual machines, et cetera, those things tend not to get patched as much because the entropy of patching them is so great, meaning, okay, I got to patch my Exchange environment. Well, what does Exchange do? It does email. Okay, now I have to go back to senior management and say, email is going to be down for a considerable amount of time. And that's usually a hard no in a multinational organization where 24/7 by 365 is the norm. So generally, Microsoft has been saying, we're putting most of our development effort, of course, all of our security effort, et cetera, into our cloud services. You might want to consider getting off of Exchange on premises and moving into Office 365 or Exchange Online. But it's not a motivation to get people to use the cloud. So of course we still issue these patches, but only a higher power would know exactly in these major products that are out on the market today, not just Microsoft products, what zero-day type vulnerabilities are in these products. And nation states tend to figure them out very, very quickly and keep them close to the vest, meaning they're not sharing it with anyone, so they can continuously take advantage of these zero-day issues before the manufacturer even has a chance to know that they exist or a chance to patch and prevent exploitation.
And I suspect that when you are having a bit of downtime, you could be scrolling down your news feed or even listening to a podcast, or when you're out meeting clients and sat in meeting rooms, I suspect you hear a lot of things that might frustrate you. So are there any myths or misconceptions that you encounter in your work that maybe we can finally lay to rest today?
Well, number one is that here in the United States anyway, and I can't speak for outside of the United States regarding healthcare records, but our powers that be, the government has, that regulates healthcare and the privacy of healthcare, has said unequivocally, you actually can host medical records in the cloud. You just have to follow these prescriptive compliance guidelines. And, Microsoft and many other vendors make solutions around controls that enable you to follow those guidelines. So it's okay, implement this type of encryption, implement this type of authentication, leverage a zero trust model, those types of things. The other thing that cloud is more expensive. Well, cloud uses a different economic model or financial model. I shouldn't really call it an economic model. This is not my specialty area, but I understand this because I was a manager in a company that adopted these financial models, right? So there's what's known as CapEx, which is capital. It's something you buy, something you hold in your hand, like a server or a box of software. And you can say, okay, I bought this, now I can depreciate it. It's a thing I own. With cloud, it's a subscription model. So it's OpEx, it's operational expenses, meaning I could subscribe, but if I don't renew my subscriptions, I don't get to keep to use the service. The service doesn't exist anywhere on my property. Possession is 9/10 of the law. So it's going to be more expensive because the expenses will go up when I start to leverage the cloud. But the cloud is so intelligent that once you start to set up your environment, and there is all kinds of prescriptive guidance, especially in Microsoft Azure, that will say, hey, you could reduce costs by doing the following things, maybe shutting off certain services when they're not needed, scaling back on certain services when they're not needed. And looks like you have 165,000 subscriptions over here of this one particular thing that nobody's ever used, right? You're not going to get that kind of visibility when you deploy software locally in your environment.
And if we look towards the future, is there anything in particular that excites you right now?
Well, I'm super, super excited about the ability of the cloud to rapidly process and create its own machine learning models. I know a lot of folks would maybe consider that the singularity and they get nervous about that, but I'm not. I think it's definitely something that we can keep in check. And it enables us to do things like determine what is malicious behavior versus what is not malicious behavior, what is maybe a false positive, or maybe what I used to call in security operations, chasing ghosts, right? Thinking something's nefarious or bad or evil, or you're being attacked and you're not. After 6 or 7 hours of analysis, you start to determine, oh gosh, this isn't really nothing. Well, the cloud allows you to, because of all of its signal and how fast it can process, really the amount of data it has, because the algorithms have been around for ages. Ages meaning decades, really. But now we have this place of almost unlimited data of the data that we can actually look at, meaning it's not personal or protected information. And we can make really, really fast decisions around whether or not something's evil. Or something's good, something makes sense. Okay, Joe usually behaves in the following way, but all of a sudden, Joe, with respect to his computer and what he's doing, he's behaving like he works for the R&D team, and that doesn't make any sense. Why is he trying to gain access to a code repository? Because that's not in his job description, right? So it's those types of decisions that can be made in microseconds, whereas in the past, you'd go years without detecting things like fraud or insider threat, or even external threats that disguise themselves as insider threats.
Well, I've loved chatting with you today about all things tech, but a question I always like to ask my guests before I let them go is if there was a particular song that has inspired them or helped them get their head in the zone before they go on stage, what would your song be and why?
Oh, that's a tough one. I am a huge music enthusiast, advocate, etc. I've written about music. But I settled on, when I saw this question before, I settled on, and hopefully you'll be pleased because they're on your side of the water, New Order's Everything's Gone Green. I would say from XYZ album, but it was never on an album. It was released mainly as a single in between Movement and Power, Corruption, and Lies, their first two albums. So, that it would be that song. One of my favorite New Order songs.
Wow. I speak to a lot of people on this podcast. I ask them that same question. And you're a true music guy. You know your stuff and you know your New Order. You didn't just go with a straightforward crowd pleaser there. So kudos to you. But before I let you go, could I ask that you remind everyone listening of where they can find out more information about anything that we talked about today, or contact your team if they've got any questions?
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter. It's at Security JWD, D as in Davis, W as in William, and J as in Joseph, right? And then I have a vanity URL thanks to Microsoft that redirects to my LinkedIn page, which is aka.ms/securityjwd. So that's aka, as also known as, .ms as in Microsoft /securityjwd. I'm really more active on LinkedIn than I am on Twitter, but typically what happens is I'll post something on LinkedIn and Twitter simultaneously. I would recommend that anyone listening today, if you're in the cybersecurity world or the compliance world, keep your eyes firmly on the security.microsoft.com blog. Because it is full of all kinds of, hey, did you know you could do this? And hey, did you know you could do that? And I think a lot of these general problems within, satisfying business requirements really just kind of live within not knowing that you could do that. And yeah, it is, almost everything is possible now. So that's really exciting.
Excellent. Well, I'll add all those links to the show notes just so people can find you nice and easily. But there's so much I loved about our conversation today. But more than anything, I think it's talking about everyday subjects such as customer cloud shared responsibility, zero trust computing and emerging threats, but in a language that everyone can understand and get everyone on that same page. So a big thank you for joining me today.
Fantastic, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Wow. I mean, chief security advisors strive to solve Microsoft customers' toughest security challenges by leveraging Microsoft end-to-end enterprise security, compliance, data governance, the information lifecycle management solutions, and I could go on and on. But I love the work that Joseph's doing here and how he ultimately strives to accelerate cloud adoption, migration, and modern workplace transformation, all through innovative cybersecurity products, engagements, and programs. But we did cover a lot of ground today in a short amount of time. So I'm curious, what were your takeaways? Is there anything that you would like to throw into the ring here that we can talk about? And remember, there's also an invite for you to come on the podcast too, if there's anything you'd like to discuss. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, etc. at Neil C. Hughes. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut this short and run because I've got another podcast to record now and I'll prepare another guest for you tomorrow. So thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.